Kaltenborn edits the news.
Good evening, everybody. For the 8th time, the air raid alarm sounded at Kirkwall, and that within 48 hours. A large German bomber, flying high, was seen by hundreds as it moved on towards Scapa Flow under the heavy fire of anti-aircraft batteries. Nothing happened. Nothing was dropped. Nothing was done. The bomber disappeared. But it showed the British once again how easy it is for German bombers to fly from a German port, reach their objective in the British Isles, and return, sometimes unscathed. Mr. Chamberlain, in the House of Commons this afternoon, said, "The attacks so far made on our coasts have been few and on a small scale, and it would be unwise to assume that we shall always be as successful as we have been in these first exchanges." Mr. Chamberlain was subjected to a good deal of criticism in the House this afternoon. Mr. Attlee, the Labourite, led a vigorous attack in Commons on the government's manner of conducting the war. "I hope," Mr. Attlee said, "we will have a very early report from the Court of Inquiry which is sitting to consider the sinking of the Royal Oak. Secondly, we ought to have some explanation as to why, apparently, the attack made by aircraft on the Firth of Forth was appreciated only when the aircraft already was actually over that area. I understand that this was the reason given as to why there was no air raid warning. I think it ought to be cleared up. Otherwise, it might tend to cause a lack of confidence in air raid warnings. It seems to me that the government is not taking nearly seriously enough the question of organization of the home front and the sustaining of morale of our people." Now that's straight talk coming from an opposition still free to speak in a democratic parliament. You hear no such criticism of anything that has happened or that hasn't happened in other countries where there is less freedom of speech, and it is significant that that goes on in Britain today. It might very well end with a change in government, but it's always a question as to whether or not that kind of frankness is better than to conceal everything and perhaps to permit mistakes to go unrebuked. Today, in Washington, the President of the United States, by proclamation, prohibited submarines of nations which are now at war from entering United States ports or territorial waters except in cases of emergency. That means that no submarine can blithely come in to any American port and blithely go out again. They're barred. Can't come in just to refuel, just to take on food, just to get a 24-hour rest. No. Under our Neutrality Act, we have the right to bar belligerent submarines, and today, by presidential proclamation, we have done so. Now, the emergencies under which a submarine could enter American ports, they are covered under international law. They use the French term force majeure, which means power beyond that of the submarine itself. And State Department officials interpreted this term as meaning an act of God or some inevitable accident. That is, if a submarine is disabled, it would have the right to come into a port of the United States, provided it came in on the surface, and presumably it could stay for 24 hours and then depart again, also on the surface, if it stayed no longer. However, if it did remain longer than that period, presumably, we would intern it. Of course, I can imagine that the submarine might even seek shelter from a terrific storm, or to escape sinking, or if it were crippled in some way. But the question is whether under some of those circumstances it might not have to be interned, even if it did not stay more than the 24 hours. Now, it's interesting that this applies to French, British, Polish, and German submarines, but does not apply to Russian submarines. And of course, the reason is that Russia, from our point of view, is not at war. When she took over White Russia and the Polish Ukraine, she declared that it was to protect the inhabitants of those areas. And Poland did not declare war. The Polish government was at that time in flight. And France and Britain, for diplomatic reasons, have also refused to declare war on Russia up to the present. Therefore, a Russian submarine is not a belligerent submarine. Now, the question arises in connection with this submarine ban as to what are territorial waters. Now, the traditional, long-standing definition under international law is a 3-mile area. But during our attempts to enforce the Prohibition Act, we extended that to a 12-mile area, and then we also worked out what was known as the doctrine of continuous pursuit. That is, if you started chasing something while it was within the 12-mile area, you could keep on chasing it even after it had gone beyond the 12-mile area. So there's another question which has never really been finally settled by the solons of international law, as to whether if a submarine were seen by an American destroyer, say within the 3-mile limit, and then started to get away as rapidly as it could and submerged, would our destroyer have a right to pursue that submarine beyond the 3-mile or the 12-mile limit and attempt to compel it to stop by whatever means were at its disposition, including, shall we say, depth charges or shells? That's also an interesting question. Then, of course, another question that might arise is that the Pan American Conference down at Panama recently decided to have an peace area of 300 miles on this side of the Atlantic. That is, the idea was that since these warring nations declare belligerent areas that extend hundreds of miles from their coasts, why shouldn't we have a right in this peaceful continent to declare an area of peace that extends some 300 miles from our coasts? Well, that too has never been taken up as a matter of international law. Of course, German submarines are supposed to have been lurking in American waters. Several submarines have been reported from various points off Miami, off Alaska, off the Canadian coast. But it's not only German submarines, of course, that are affected. This proclamation is directed equally against all, so no one can say that it isn't neutral. Our Neutrality Act, by the way, is now coming near the final stages of amendment. Today, the committee decided that they would put in a clause requiring the payment of cash for all war materials instead of the 90 days credit which was provided in the original bill. That won't make any material difference. It's just as easy for a belligerent that actually has credits here in the United States to make them available at once than make them available at the end of 90 days. Practically, that's not going to have any particular effect. But another exemption that was decided on is going to have a tremendously important effect, and that is to exempt certain areas from the restrictions of the bill on American commerce in American ships. And they've decided that these areas that are to be exempted from the operation of the Neutrality Act are both the Pacific and Atlantic sides of the Canadian coast, South American ports, Central American countries, the Pacific and the Indian Oceans, the Arabia and China Seas, and the Bay of Bengal. Now, it would only seem reasonable that American ships should be permitted to carry on commerce, particularly at this time when they have a good opportunity to develop that commerce and thereby to advance the interests of the American merchant marine in areas where no war so far has been going on. Of course, there's the trouble when you try to outline everything in a bill. If you gave the President of the United States the authority to restrict the movement of American ships, whenever he should find that a certain area of the seas had become a belligerent area, why then you could be very much more liberal, and the President could issue these restrictions and remove them as the war developed. As it is, many people fear that the attempt to prescribe all these things rigidly in the Neutrality Act is not going to work out. We do know that so far the Neutrality Act has never yet measured up to any emergency that has developed in the years in which it's been on the statute books. We've always had to change it just as soon as any particular situation arose. There's a very interesting conference tonight in Stockholm. 3 kings and a president are meeting in the Swedish capital to see what they can do to preserve their own peace. They're all menaced by mighty Russia, which has made demands on little Finland. They all hope to find some way of meeting those demands. And today, they got some moral support from the President of the United States, who sent a telegram to the King of Sweden in which he said, "The conference of the Nordic states convened by your Majesty in Stockholm will be followed with deep interest by the government and people of the United States. This government joins with the governments of the other American republics in expressing its support of the principles of neutrality and order under law, for which the nations represented at the Stockholm Conference have throughout their history taken a consistent stand. It's good that voices should continue to be raised on behalf of international law, on behalf of the moral order in the world, for in time of war, we're apt to take acts of violence too much for granted and to forget that fundamentally the world can only progress if acts of violence are controlled by law. And Turkey tonight is in a difficult situation. Her ambassador, her foreign minister, who was Turkey's ambassador to the Soviet state, returns to his own country without having made an agreement. And who knows what mighty Russia will now ask next. And in Rome, they tell us that they believe that a mighty offensive is coming on the Western Front. Perhaps it's true. We must remember that the Nazi revolution is inherently dynamic. It has carried out important offensive action at least once in 6 months since it began in 1933. There has been a constant pressure in Germany for immediate, constant action. And so many political observers believe that in spite of the tremendous difficulties which faced Germany on the Maginot Line, that the temperament of Adolf Hitler and the very dynamism that is inherent in that German revolution will compel them to strike, that they cannot wait. They must act, even in the face of a tremendously superior force. Good night.